And you're watching Eagle News International. On tonight's headlines. Russian forces attacked the plant in the southeastern city of Enerhodar early on Friday morning, setting an adjacent 5-story training facility on fire. The blaze was later extinguished. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi says security systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected. Foreign ministers arriving at a NATO meeting in Brussels condemned Russia's shelling of the nuclear power plant in Ukraine. First in our news, Russian forces attacked the plant in the southeastern city of Enerhodar early on Friday morning, setting an adjacent 5-story training facility on fire, but the blaze was later extinguished. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson slammed Moscow's assault as reckless, warning it could directly threaten the safety of all Europe. His remarks came after the United States and Canada also voiced concern over the attacks on the facility. Russian troops attacked Europe's largest nuclear power plant, setting part of the Ukrainian facility ablaze in an assault the country's leader branded a nuclear terror and said could endanger the continent. President Zelensky angrily denounced the attack in a video message. Take a look.
It's not about I want to talk with Putin. I think I have to talk with Putin. The world has to talk with Putin because there are no other ways to stop this war. That's why I have to.
This type of reactor is nothing like the Chernobyl reactor that went up.
It's not about I want to talk with Putin. I think I have to talk with Putin. The world has to talk with Putin because there are no other ways to stop this war. That's why I have to.
We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
Mr. Bawal, may ibis ka, oh. Ba't doon? It's a prank! Okay lang manakot! Pero kung mananakot ka para sa boto, bawal yan!
Ayon sa Omnibus Election Code, threats, intimidation, terrorism, use of fraudulent device or other forms of coercion is an election offense.
Sino kausap mo? Makaalis na nga, sa iba na lang ako mananakot. Mr. Pwede! Mr. Pwede! May malaking ibis sa likod mo! Nox! Babawi ka pa, ha? Di mo ako maiisahan! Ako si Mr. Bawal na nagpapaalala sa inyo na ang pananakot para sa boto. Ibis! Hoy! Bawal yan!
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang angking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Kung gano'n na naman, paano kung muling masaktan? Ito na naman, puso'y naguguluhan.
Hi guys! Ako nga pala si Christy Fidera at abangan niyo po ako bilang guest performer sa Letters and Music ngayong darating na linggo na, March 6, 1 to 2 p.m. At syempre, dito lang sa Net 25. See ya!
To aspiring fashion designers, starting a clothing brand is a dream come true. They have the ideas, the talent, and most importantly, the passion for fashion. But what does it really take to start a fashion brand? Anong kailangan gawin lalo na ngayon at bumabangon pa lamang ang fashion retail industry sa gitna ng pandemya? We will tackle these questions with one of the world-class and homegrown women's fashion brands in the Philippines. Join us as the President and CEO of Camiseta Group of Companies, Ms. Chris Roque, discusses how to start a fashion brand in this episode of Open for Business.
I feel that all of us in general must live our best life, meaning we should put our best. Let's push ourselves to the limit or how far we want to go so that we live a life of no regrets.
Araw-araw may bagong kaalaman. Dahil sa Tony Knows, everybody knows! Your Kuya Tony Petgaba na hindi naubusan ng tips. Siyempre, from DIY to life hacks, sagot ko na yan. Saan ka pa? Let's all play together. Let's have fun together. Tara na, sumali at makigulo sa aming Kada Challenge. Sa kada umaga, kompleto na ang inyong umaga.
Hi guys! Ako nga po pala si Franz Rojas at abangan niyo po ako bilang guest performer sa Letters and Music ngayong darating na linggo, March 6, 1 to 2 p.m. Siyempre, dito lamang yan sa Net 25. See you po!
May boto ang karapat-dapat! Tama! Lahat ng Pilipino pwedeng bumoto!
Kung rehistrado ka.
Ha?
Ang lahat ng Pilipinong rehistrado lamang ang maaaring bumoto. 1 taon ang ibinibigay ng Commission on Elections para magparehistro ang mga Pilipinong boboto sa darating na eleksyon. Kailangan gawin ito para maiwasan ang tinatawag na flying voters. Teka, lahat ba kayo nagparehistro na?
Opo! Rehistrado na kami lahat!
Bakit tahimik ka? Hindi ka nakapagrehistro, no?
Nakakalimutan ko.
Ay, hindi ka pwedeng bumoto. Mabuti pa, bumili ka na lang ng balot.
Pagka kami pa bumili ng balot, pwede na kami bumoto.
Hindi, pero mabubusog ka. Para sa karagdagang kaalaman, makipag-ugnayan lang sa pinakamalapit na barangay o bisitahin ang COMELEC website.
Sandali! Sandali!
Oh, may nagkagusto kasi sa akin ng gorilla. Tapos nakawala siya. Kuya, ano nangyari? May nagpakawala!
I want to tie the knot na. Babe. Natindihan mo ba, babe?
Hindi ko talaga narinig eh. Baka pwedeng pakiulat itong data.
Itong game natin, kailangan mabutas ang plastic sa pamamagitan ng inyong mga mukha.
Welcome back. Russian forces attacked the plant in the southeastern city of Enerhoda early on Friday morning, setting an adjacent 5-story training facility on fire. The blaze was later extinguished. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson slammed Moscow's assault as reckless, warning it could directly threaten the safety of all of Europe. His remarks came after the U.S. and Canada also voiced concern over the attacks on the facility. Russian troops attacked Europe's largest nuclear power plant, setting part of the Ukrainian facility ablaze in an assault the country's leader branded nuclear terror and said could endanger the continent. President Zelensky angrily denounced the attack in a video message. Let's take a look.
Звертаюся до всіх українців, до всіх європейців, до всіх людей, хто знає слово Чорнобиль, хто знає, скільки горя і жертв приніс вибух на атомній станції. Це була глобальна катастрофа. З її наслідками боролися сотні тисяч людей, евакуювали десятки тисяч людей. Росія хоче це повторити і вже повторює, але у 6 разів більше. Ми зв'язалися з нашими лідерами, з партнерами. Я говорив вже з Шарлем Мішелем, Шольцем, говорив з Дудою, говорив з президентом Байденом. Ми зв'язалися з головою МАГАТЕ Гросі, також прем'єр-міністром Джонсоном. Ми всіх попереджаємо. Жодна держава, окрім Росії, ніколи не обстрілювала атомні енергоблоки. Вперше в нашій історії, в історії людства, держава-терорист вдалася і до ядерного терору.
The Zaporizhzhia reactors operate on fuel enriched with fissile isotope uranium-235. They work by the core, heating steam. But unlike other reactors, the nuclear contaminated steam is not used to generate energy. Instead, it's used to power another uncontaminated steam circuit, which then turns the turbines. And this means that radiation levels for workers at the plant are relatively low. Background radiation levels around the plant are currently at around 0.1 microsieverts per hour, according to the plant's operator. And that is below the global average of background radiation and much less than flying on an airplane or getting an X-ray. Take a look.
This type of reactor is nothing like the Chernobyl reactor that went up in 1986. It's a very different reactor design. It's a pressurized water reactor. The other one was a water-cooled graphite moderated reactor that didn't really have a containment vessel. This reactor, the reactor is inside a very solid concrete containment vessel that's designed to protect it for things like rocket fire, and also to if the core is ruptured, to contain that radioactivity. So I think in the case of a fire, if the fire was to compromise the backup cooling systems by, say, cutting power to the site or something like that, I think that would be the highest risk. And that might be a situation where you might get some damage to the core. I myself am not overly alarmed about the possibility of a radiological accident, but by the same token, I'm nervous.
The station at the industrial city in the southeast supplies an estimated 40% of the country's nuclear power and, according to Zelensky, houses 6 of Ukraine's 15 reactors. Ukraine's nuclear facilities have been a main point of concern after Russia's military invaded the country last week and began bombarding cities with shells and missiles. And this evening, President Zelensky appealed for direct talks with President Putin.
It's not about I want to talk with Putin. I think I have to talk with Putin. The world has to talk with Putin because there are no other ways to stop this war. That's why I have to.
Russian President today doubled down after a call with French President Emmanuel Macron. The French official warned, quote, "The worst is yet to come." Let's listen in.
Уважаемые товарищи, хочу сказать, что специальная военная операция идет в строгом соответствии с графиком, по плану. Все поставленные задачи успешно решаются. Когда не откажусь я от своего убеждения, что русские и украинцы – это один народ. Даже несмотря на то, что часть жителей Украины запугали, многие оболванены нацистской националистической пропагандой. А кто-то сознательно, конечно, пошел по пути бандеровцев, других приспешников нацистов, которые в годы Великой Отечественной войны воевали на стороне Гитлера.
Foreign ministers arriving at a NATO meeting in Brussels condemned Russia's shelling of the nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Allies met Friday for a busy day of diplomacy in Brussels, looking to keep the pressure on after hitting Moscow with a wave of punishing sanctions over the invasion of Ukraine. Let's listen in.
In the night, obviously we condemn such an egregious attack that puts the security and health of civilians at risk, not only in the city but also throughout the region.
We have to strengthen the eastern flank of NATO. Speaking of NATO action, as the European Union, we will continue to discuss sanctions, and we have to make sure that all international community understand that this is a serious violation of any thinkable international law and even nuclear regulation.
Okay. Condemn the attacks on civilians, and over the night we have also seen reports about the attack against the nuclear power plant. This just demonstrates the recklessness of this war and the importance of ending it, and the importance of Russia withdrawing all its troops and engaging in good faith in diplomatic efforts.
Meanwhile, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi said security systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected.
So it's important to say that all the safety systems of the 6 reactors at the plant were not affected at all, and that there has been no release of radioactive material. No release of radioactive material.
Meanwhile, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog also today offered to travel to Chernobyl to negotiate with Ukraine and Russia on ensuring the security of Ukraine's nuclear sites. Take a look.
I have indicated to both the Russian Federation and the Ukraine my availability and disposition to travel to Chernobyl as soon as possible, so that these 7 crucial pillars are never again compromised.
Grossi said the aim of the trip would be to discuss with both sides a framework to safeguard the security and functioning of Ukraine's nuclear sites. On February 24, Russia seized the site of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, which left hundreds dead and spread radioactive contamination west across Europe. Grossi said that any trip would take place after his return from Tehran on Saturday. There he is due to hold talks with senior Iranian officials over outstanding questions the IAEA has about past nuclear activity at undeclared sites in Iran. In other developments, Russia's media watchdog said Friday it had restricted access to the BBC and other independent media websites, tightening controls over the internet more than 1 week after Russia invaded Ukraine. Access to websites of the BBC, the independent news website Meduza, German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, and the Russian language website of the U.S.-funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Svoboda were limited by Roskomnadzor following a request from prosecutors. Russia has intensified its crackdown on independent and critical voices since launching an invasion in Ukraine last week. On Thursday, the liberal radio station Echo Moskvy announced it was shutting down after being taken off air over its coverage of the war. Meanwhile, Ukraine and Russia agreed to create humanitarian corridors to evacuate civilians on Thursday in a second round of talks since Moscow invaded last week. According to negotiators on both sides, Russia's main negotiator and former culture minister Vladimir Medinsky said they're calling on civilians who find themselves in this situation if military actions continue to use these humanitarian corridors. Ukraine says at least 350 civilians have been killed since President Putin launched an attack on Ukraine last week. Moscow claims it does not target civilian areas. Meanwhile, the European Union also offered temporary protection for Ukrainian refugees, so far numbered at 1 million. The protection allows refugees from Ukraine and their family members to receive a residence permit and the right to access work and education for an initial year, renewable every 6 months for a total of 2 years. In Washington, the administration of President Joe Biden also announced a similar move, granting temporary protected status to Ukrainians already in the country. And that means they can remain in the U.S. and the threat of deportation is lifted. EU interior ministers agreed in a Brussels meeting to activate a temporary protection mechanism drawn up 2 decades ago in response to the wars in the former Yugoslavia, but never used. Meanwhile, UN High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi said in just 7 days, 1 million people have fled Ukraine, uprooted by this, quote, senseless war. And he stressed that peace is the only way to stop this tragedy. Take a look.
In just 7 days, 1 million people have fled Ukraine, uprooted by this senseless war. I have worked in refugee emergencies for almost 40 years, and rarely have I seen an exodus as rapid as this one. Hour by hour, minute by minute, more people are fleeing the terrifying reality of violence. Countless have been displaced inside the country. And unless there is an immediate end to the conflict, millions more are likely to be forced to flee Ukraine. Inside Ukraine, our staff and other humanitarians are working where and when they can, in frightening conditions. Our staff stay, even at great risk, because we know the needs in the country are huge. Despite the extraordinary pace and challenges, the response from governments and local communities in receiving this 1 million refugees has been remarkable. UNHCR staff have already surged throughout the region and are scaling up our protection and assistance programs for refugees in support of host governments. International solidarity has been heartwarming. But nothing can replace the need for the guns to be silenced, for dialogue and diplomacy to succeed. Peace is the only way to halt this tragedy.
Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that Russian President Vladimir Putin's action in Ukraine qualify as a war crime. Patricia Rodriguez reports from our UK bureau.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Wednesday called Russian President Vladimir Putin a war criminal and urged a UN consensus to condemn Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Boris Johnson's comments came in Parliament, where MPs gave a standing ovation to Ukraine's ambassador in attendance. Johnson wore a UK-Ukraine flag pin, and many lawmakers wore clothing in Ukraine's blue and yellow colors. UK ministers have been warning that Putin, his cronies, and commanders could face prosecution at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which has already opened a probe into the invasion. Ahead of a vote by the UN General Assembly in New York, Johnson added that the UK is calling every nation to join them in condemning Russia and demanding that Putin turns his tanks around. Johnson warned of further sanctions if the offensive continues, reprising a new three-word slogan, "Putin must fail." He stresses that with the heroism of Ukraine's people and the unity of the West, he has no doubt of Putin's imminent downfall and their success in protecting Ukraine. Here's Boris Johnson's latest statement.
What we have seen already from Vladimir Putin's regime in the use of the munitions that they have already been dropping on innocent civilians, Mr. Speaker, in my view, already fully qualifies as a war crime. And I know that the ICC prosecutor is already investigating, and I'm sure the whole House will support that. Putin has gravely miscalculated. In his abhorrent assault on a sovereign nation, he has underestimated the extraordinary fortitude of the Ukrainian people and the unity and resolve of the free world in standing up to his barbarism. With the unity of this House, Mr. Speaker, with the continued heroism and resolve of the Ukrainian people, which is so amazing that we've seen over the last few days, and with the unity of the West that we are seeing, which I think has also taken aback President Putin, I've no doubt at all, Mr. Speaker, that he will fail and that we will succeed in protecting Ukraine.
Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I'm Patricia Rodriguez. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Patricia. Meanwhile, retired Army Major John Spencer, the chair of Urban Warfare Studies with the Madison Policy Forum, says the best Ukraine strategy is to defend urban terrain because they call it the great equalizer. Let's see what it means. Let's listen in.
This entire war is over Kiev. Kiev must hold or the war is over. And also, President Zelensky is the key to winning because hope is the greatest weapon they have on the battlefield, all Ukrainians, the hope that they can survive. And he's given to them. They are dominating information warfare. They are dominating giving the troops what they need, which is hope, will, mission. He is winning. Russia needed to get to Kiev fast. It didn't. Still working on that. And every obstacle, doesn't matter if you strike them in the open or put something in front of them, will prevent them from that. It'll slow them down. It'll make them vulnerable. And it could potentially stop them. And my hope is that when they do hit Kiev and they surround it, that they just hit a concrete wall trying to get in, with just every street. I mean, and that's just, I agree, that's the best Ukraine strategy, is to defend urban terrain, because we call it the great equalizer. Even the most advanced military, to include Western militaries, get sucked into urban terrain and they can't use a lot of their highly technological advantages. They can't use a lot of the ISR, the long-range precision. No military wants to engage another military close up. We always try to engage them as far as we can. The urban terrain forces the close fight. Russia is going to struggle to keep cohesion in their troops. You already see they're having that problem, let alone elevating that up to like the will of the people in Russia to continue to pay the price. Really, this comes down to what the value of the objectives are to both sides. how much does Russia value taking Ukraine and taking Kiev? We know the Ukrainians, people say this, but they're demonstrating with action. They're willing to pay the ultimate price. When fighting meets the urban terrain, usually civilians flee. And I hope that the green corridors that so far have stayed open continue to be open so they can leave. But I think we have the potential here to see civilian casualties dating back to World War II levels, really.
In a narrow backyard at the outskirts of Lviv, western Ukraine, 36-year-old Taras and his friends are making use of every piece of scrap metal they can lay their hands on for a higher purpose, to build homemade anti-tank obstacles which might eventually stop a Russian military advance. Let's take a look.
I'm working in IT industry, like a developer. But for now, I have unexpected vacation, I think, because this is more important thing for me just for now, because it's more important for all country. It was almost all Romanian mountains.
Я мав матеріал, який я мав використати в себе на будівництві. Я будинок будую. І я цей матеріал першим віддав на цей їжак. І потім ми зробили пост в Фейсбуці, в Інстаграмі, друзі почали постити і почали зголошуватись дуже багато людей. І привозити метал, дуже багато дзвонити, пропонувати, що нам потрібно. Всі матеріали, всім ми забезпечені повністю вже фактично.
Meanwhile, the World Health Organization said a shipment of life-saving medical supplies has arrived in Warsaw for delivery to Ukraine. WHO's Emergency Medical Teams Network leader Flavio Salio said 36 tons of supplies arrived from the organization's warehouse in Dubai, and more is en route as the need continues rising across Ukraine. Take a look.
I'm here in Poland, where 36 metric tons of medical supplies have just landed, destined for Ukraine. We have surgical supplies to treat the wound, as well as medicine for all other diseases that do not stop for work. The supplies will be moved into truck to the border with Ukraine, and then further to support the affected health system.
The WHO representative in Ukraine, Jarno Habich, said that as the situation evolves, it is becoming harder to distribute the goods within Ukraine. He said it's uncertain whether the supplies can reach where they are most needed in the country's health system. The WHO also said that new cases of coronavirus infection have been declining in Ukraine since February. Meanwhile, the U.S. will impose new sanctions on Russian oligarchs, including a travel ban. President Joe Biden announces at a cabinet meeting in the White House. Let's take a look.
Today, I'm announcing that we're adding dozens of names to the list, including one of Russia's wealthiest billionaires, and I'm banning travel to America by more than 50 Russian oligarchs, their families, and their close associates.
The oligarchs, government officials, and business owners who have amassed vast wealth in an economy where only President Putin loyalists can get ahead are seen as vulnerable because much of their wealth is tied to Western interests. And up next, Asian markets stumbled Friday and oil rose as news that Europe's biggest nuclear power plant had been hit by Russian shelling fueled a flight to safety and ramped up fears about the Ukraine war. And President Duterte has signed into law a measure amending the Foreign Investment Act to make the Philippines more accessible to foreign investors. That and more when Eagle News comes back.
Abangan ang mga istorya ng pagbangon sa Season 2 ng Lingap Stories tuwing Linggo, alas 5 ng hapon sa Net 25.
Welcome back. Asian markets stumbled today and oil rose as news that Europe's biggest nuclear power plant had been hit by Russian shelling fueled the flight to safety and ramped up fears about the Ukraine war. And as Vladimir Putin's forces stepped up their invasion, Ukraine's foreign minister demanded an immediate ceasefire to avoid disaster at the Zaporizhzhia plant after its power unit was hit. Take a look. Now, Tokyo and Hong Kong led losses across Asia, while Sydney, Shanghai, Seoul, Singapore, Mumbai, Taipei, Manila, Bangkok, and Wellington were also well down. London, Paris, and Frankfurt opened deep in the red. Meanwhile, the dollar dipped against the safe haven yen, though it rose against most other currencies, including sitting at its highest level against the euro since mid-20. Now, meanwhile, Brent North Sea crude was up 1.2% at $111.77 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate was also up 1.8% at $109.60 per barrel. President Duterte has signed into law a measure amending the Foreign Investment Act, or FIA, or FIA, to make the Philippines more accessible to foreign investors. The new law allows qualified non-Philippine nationals to do business in the country or invest in a domestic enterprise up to 100% of its capital and liberalizes the practice of professions not governed by existing special laws. The law also allows foreign investors to set up 100% ownership of all small and medium-sized enterprises. Albay Representative Joey Salceda, who was a principal author of the House version, said the law could boost the country's bid to be a leading startup hub in Southeast Asia, especially for tech and other companies seeking to solve long-standing problems in financial inclusion, agricultural productivity, health delivery, and other key services. Meanwhile, monetary authorities are closely monitoring developments overseas, such as upticks in oil prices, its impact on domestic inflation, and any second-round effects. Prices of oil in the international market further rose recently, and Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas Governor Benjamin Diokno, in a Viber message to journalists today, traced this to the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which have raised global and domestic macroeconomic uncertainty over the near term. Under these circumstances, the BSP will continue to closely monitor the emerging risks to the outlook for inflation and remain vigilant against possible second-round effects from supply-side pressures or any shifts in the public's inflation expectations, he said. The government has allocated a budget for subsidies to sectors affected by the oil price upticks, such as public utility vehicle drivers and operators and farmers. Diokno said the central bank supports the non-monetary measures by the national government to help mitigate the impact of higher oil prices and avoid the broadening of price pressures. To pandemic news now, slowly ditching the face mask requirement in open areas under Alert Level 1 status in the country is possible if COVID cases continue to go down. NTF Against COVID-19 Special Medical Advisor Dr. Ted Herbosa said at the Laging Handa public briefing today, it may be considered as one of the adjustments under the so-called new normal. Let's listen in.
And I can tell you from history, anytime we sit silent and watch the rights of one group be eviscerated, it's just a matter of time till it comes back to haunt us. This is the 1930s all over again.
Well, wag niyong personal na view ko ito. Ang tingin ko susunod maatin yung pagsuot ng mask sa outdoor areas. So sa indoors na lang tayo magmamask, lalo na kung mababa ang cases. And then yung mga iba pang restrictions, matanggal lahat para magkaroon na tayo ng new normal.
User from inhaling or absorbing droplets and particles that other people may breathe, cough, or sneeze out, especially if worn properly, and will cover the nose and mouth. Only 853 new infections were recorded today for an overall 50,230 active cases, down from the previous day's 866 new infections. And as part of continuing efforts to bring back normalcy, the government will hold another national COVID vaccination days on March 10 and 11, prioritizing the administration of booster doses to senior citizens and those with comorbidities. A specialty vaccine company announced that the National Health Regulatory Authority of the Kingdom of Bahrain has granted emergency use authorization for Valneva's inactivated adjuvanted COVID-19 vaccine. Here's our correspondent from Bahrain, Clem Orhaliza, for the details. Clem.
French-Austrian biotech firm Valneva on Tuesday said its COVID-19 vaccine received emergency authorization for use in Bahrain, the first approval for its jab. Valneva committed to supplying the Gulf Kingdom with 1 million doses in advance purchase agreement last year and plans to deliver the first batches at the end of March. The jab, which uses the traditional technology of inactivated virus, will offer an alternative vaccine to the Bahraini population and medical community, said Valneva President Thomas Lingelbach. Bahrain has reported more than 1,400 COVID-related deaths and cases exceed 500,000. More than 70% of the population has received at least one vaccine dose. Valneva says it remains determined to gain further authorization for the VLA 2001 jab. It hopes to receive conditional approval for the use in the European Union by the end of March. The company has agreed with the European Commission to supply the bloc with up to 60 million doses by 2023. Reporting from Manama, Bahrain, this is Clem Orhaliza for Eagle News International.
Meanwhile, Australia's emergency services ordered 200,000 people to flee from the path of a wild storm that has already killed 13 people in a week of record-setting East Coast floods. But the city of Sydney escaped the worst of the deluge. Let's listen in.
So if those evacuation orders are made, if those evacuation warnings are made, we need to get ready. We need to work together to make sure we get through this as a state. Whilst we are certainly seeing devastating scenes up north, we can all take heart in the courage and the bravery that we are seeing in our people, in our frontline volunteers, in our emergency services personnel, but ultimately our people, and particularly in the north, who have gone through a very difficult time over the last few years, whether that's through bushfires and floods. And here we are again. One thing that we know, and one thing that I know as Premier, is that our people will always pull through.
Authorities issued severe rain and wind warnings for a 400-kilometer stretch of the coast as water levels rose rapidly, including in suburbs around Sydney, Australia's largest city and home to 5 million people. The unpredictable storm front has crawled southwards along the east coast from Queensland to New South Wales, creating havoc as rivers and reservoirs broke their banks with water, swamping homes up to their roofs. Scientists say climate change is making Australia's floods, bushfires, cyclones, and droughts more frequent and more intense. New South Wales said it was sending an extra 400 personnel to that region to help people on the very, very long road to cleaning up and recovering. At least 30 people were killed and 80 wounded in a suicide attack at a white mosque on Friday in the northwestern Pakistani city of Peshawar, where rescuers frantically ferried the dead and wounded from the scene. One witness saw the attacker enter the mosque before Friday prayers and opened fire with a pistol, picking out the worshippers one by one, and he then blew himself up. The attack comes as the first day of a cricket test match in Rawalpindi, around 190 kilometers to the east between Pakistan and Australia, who haven't toured the country in nearly a quarter of a century because of security concerns. No group immediately claimed responsibility. Sunni majority Pakistan has recently been battling a resurgence of its domestic chapter of the Taliban, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP. And that's all the time we have for you today. As always, I'll end the day on a thoughtful note. Our ability to look back and smile at our past is God's plan to keep us moving forward. This has been Eagle News International. I'm Alma Angela. Stay alert and stay informed because we live in interesting times. Good night.